I call the meeting to order. We can start. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We are pleased to meet you this afternoon. To introduce myself, my name is Dumisani Dladla. I am the head of the ATT Secretariat, and I'm the secretary for this meeting. On the 4th of April 2022, the president of conference, seated next to me, announced that the second series of CSP8 prep meetings will be held in person with an option for those who cannot attend in person to participate remotely. Accordingly, the Secretariat has made the necessary arrangement to make this meeting format a reality. As we have done in the past, I would like to make some few points regarding how the meeting would proceed. Regarding the interpretation, I hereby confirm that the meeting has got the benefit of interpretation into all UN languages. Those who are present in the room at the present moment will be able to have an option. They can choose using their own device in front of them, where you can choose the language that you prefer. Whereas those who are joining us remotely will therefore see a button at the bottom of the screen, which will be available for them to choose the language of, that they would want to use for this meeting. Regarding the speakers list, there is no speakers list that has been prepared in advance of this meeting. When the time for discussions come, if you are in the room, you would raise your nameplate if you want to have an opportunity to speak. But those who are joining us remotely, if they wish to speak, they would make use of the chat function and indicate their request to speak. Those online or participating remotely, when they do join, would request them to indicate very clearly who they are speaking on behalf of, because that would be very important for the record. And at the same time, we request all those who are participating remotely to have their microphones off until such time that they are called upon to speak. We request all delegates then not to use the chat function for purposes of talking to about everyone in the room, but the chat function should be reserved then for only directing questions to the Secretariat or requesting the floor. Beyond that, we would request that we don't overutilize the chat function. For this afternoon, we have a session, 2 sessions to run for 3 hours. The first 2 hours of the session will be dedicated to the sub-working group on Article 6 and 7. And after that, we'll have the last hour of today dedicated to Article 9. To open the proceedings for today, I have the honor to invite the president of CSP8, Ambassador Thomas Gubel of Germany, to open this meeting. Over to you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Ladler. Good afternoon. Also from my side, I'm pleased to welcome all representatives of state parties, signatory states, other states, civil society, and industry for this first day of ATT in-person meeting. As we've just heard, we have arranged an option for remote participation arranged for this week. However, let me say I'm very encouraged by the number of representatives physically present here today, and I'm happy that you all could make it to travel to Geneva. A warm welcome also to all those who will participate in this meeting remotely from different parts of the world. The series of meetings planned for this week provide another ideal opportunity for participants to further exchange views and share experiences on ATT universalization and implementation. And I would say it's even more ideal as we have now and this time this possibility to meet in presence and to have the necessary interactive communication in the room and also in the corridors. So you will recall that the 7th Conference of State Parties last year decided that an informal preparatory process should be established for the 8th Conference of States Parties, which is scheduled for 22 to 26 of August this year. The ATT meetings taking place this week, following the February meetings, form part of an informal process organized to provide ATT stakeholders with a platform to participate meaningfully in preparations for the forthcoming 8th Conference of State Parties. During the course of this week, the 3 standing ATT working groups established by the 3rd Conference of State Parties will continue with their respective work and present a continuous platform for exchange on various priority topics with a view to achieving outcomes that assist states in the practical implementation of the treaty at a national level. According to the schedule of the working groups meetings for this week, the working group of treaty implementation will start today. You will be reminded that this work is chaired by the Republic of Korea, by my colleague Ambassador Lim, which is assisted by 3 facilitators, Spain for Article 6 and 7, South Africa for Article 9, and Serbia for Article 11. Second in line will be the working group on treaty and universalization, which is co-chaired by Germany as the CSP8 presidency and Sierra Leone the CSP7 presidency. We will then conclude with the working group on transparency, co-chaired by the Netherlands and Panama. Documents for the meetings taking place this week were circulated by the ATT Secretariat to the ATT community and are currently also published on the ATT website in all languages of the treaty, that is the Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, and Spanish. To further facilitate exchanges in the ATT meetings for this week, I'm pleased to confirm that all working groups meetings, as well as the informal preparatory meeting on Friday, will enjoy live in-session interpretation. And the Secretariat has just explained how to make full use of this possibility. So as I conclude, I look forward to lively discussions during the working group meetings this week and to receiving the working group's progress reports at the CSP8 informal preparatory meeting on Friday. Thank you very much for your attention, and without further delay, I would now invite my colleague Ambassador Ignacio Sanchez from Spain, the facilitator of the working group, sub-working group on Article 6 and 7, to commence his work, and invite him here to the podium. So please, Ambassador, join us. Thank you very much.
Muy buenos días. Muchas gracias por su presencia, sobre todo todos los que se han desplazado a Ginebra para asistir presencialmente a las reuniones del grupo de trabajo. En nuestro caso, tenemos que retomar la tarea que dejamos en la sesión del mes de febrero. La pandemia ha condicionado nuestro trabajo. Si recuerdan, el mes de febrero, al decidir el formato híbrido de las sesiones, privados de la posibilidad de hacerlo totalmente en persona, por las restricciones de viaje que aún sufren algunos países, hemos debido reducir también el tiempo necesario para los debates. En febrero, mi intención había sido iniciar el debate sobre los asuntos 6 y 7 de la agenda, perdón, 5 y 6 de la agenda, y sin embargo no conseguimos llegar al asunto 6 por la riqueza del debate previo. Por eso mi propuesta hoy es que trabajemos ampliamente sobre el ámbito del artículo 6, lo que son en nuestro plan de trabajo multianual los asuntos o topics 6 y 7, con el fin de que podamos avanzar lo más posible y si lo conseguimos, cerrar este debate de modo que retomemos la normalidad de nuestra agenda de cara a las próximas reuniones y recuperemos el tiempo perdido. Para este debate, en el plan multianual de trabajo aprobamos una orientación basada en una serie de preguntas. Evidentemente no se trata en esta reunión de que nos inventemos definiciones nuevas sobre estas preguntas, ni que busquemos nuevos términos legales, porque de lo que se trata más bien es de clarificar que las respuestas de estas preguntas están ya incluidas en instrumentos internacionales reconocidos, firmados por una gran mayoría de los Estados, y que nos permiten simplemente definir hasta qué punto podemos incluir ese lenguaje directamente en nuestra guía voluntaria de trabajo. Estoy buscando mi bolígrafo, que no lo encuentro para tomar nota de lo que digan ustedes, pero lo encontraré. It must be somewhere. I brought it with me. Por lo tanto, lo que les planteo es que hagamos un debate abierto, que hagan sus declaraciones generales o específicas, pero sin el ánimo de cuestionar los conceptos, sino de definir exactamente dónde se regulan, cuáles son las respuestas para que tengamos un lenguaje que podamos después incorporar a nuestra guía, lo que será el trabajo de la próxima sesión. No sé si es necesario que les repita las preguntas, las tienen en el plan de trabajo, pero igual si es conveniente que lo haga brevemente, lo voy a hacer directamente en inglés, que es como vienen establecidas para que no generemos confusiones de traducción. Para el punto 6, las preguntas son: What does shall not authorize any transfer entail in the context of Article 6? What obligations and the measures adopted by the United Nations Security Council are covered under Article 6.1? What international obligations and the international agreements are relevant under Article 6.2? Para la sesión séptima, las preguntas que nos planteábamos eran: What constitutes knowledge at the time of authorization under Article 6.3? How is genocide defined under international law? How are crimes against humanity defined under international law? What are grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions of 1949? What are attacks against civilian objects or civilians protected as such? What other war crimes may be included? Por lo tanto, lo que les invito es a tratar estas preguntas de un modo abierto. No tiene que ser específicamente pregunta por pregunta, sino hacer sus contribuciones para que podamos clarificar las respuestas y determinar esos instrumentos legales que deberemos entonces mencionar en la guía voluntaria de formación. Por lo tanto, lo que les invito es a iniciar el debate en sí, a intervenir lo más amplia y ricamente posible. Tenemos por delante 2 horas. Creo que no es necesario hacer ninguna pausa, la haremos al final para dar paso al siguiente grupo de trabajo. Por lo que, teniendo en cuenta que no ha habido peticiones previas de intervención, la lista de intervenciones queda abierta en este momento y les invito a que tomen la palabra. Muchas gracias. La delegación de Suiza tiene la palabra.
Mr. Facilitator, thank you for giving us the floor. We gladly provide our interpretation on the mentioned concepts in Article 6. With respect to the first question, it is our understanding that any physical transfer of conventional arms across the border with an associated transfer of control is subject to the prohibition in Article 6, irrespective of whether it is a sale, a loan, a lease, or a gift. For example, if country A sends conventional weapons for a peacekeeping mission to country B and then hands the control over the conventional arms over to the country B, this should count as a transfer that falls under the ATT. With respect to the second question, it is Switzerland's understanding that these obligations concern all actions with respect to the threats to the peace, breaches of the peace, and acts of aggression according to Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. Regarding the last question, we consider at least 7 international obligations as relevant under Article 6, paragraph 2. These are first, the UN Charter, second, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, the CCW and its protocols, third, the Anti-Personal Landmines Convention, fourth, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, fifth, the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, sixth, the Firearms Protocol, seventh, the Convention Against Corruption. This list is not exhaustive. Under other international agreements with regard to international humanitarian law and human rights law may also be of relevant to Article 6 too. Regarding Article 7, the term knowledge, it is the understanding of Switzerland that the state party concerned shall not authorize the transfer if it has reliable information providing substantial grounds to believe that the arms or items would be used in the commission of the crimes listed. Regarding the term genocide, it is important to highlight that it is explicitly defined by the Genocide Convention and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. The term crimes against humanity is defined in the Rome Statute and the customary international law. War crimes are serious violations of international law. They include the grave breaches as defined in the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and Additional Protocol 1 and in the Rome Statute. They also include other serious violations as defined in the Rome Statute and customary international law. We therefore do not see a need to define these concepts in the voluntary guide, but would prefer a reference to these existing sources of international law. We will provide this information in detail in writing to you, Mr. Facilitator. Thank you for giving me the floor.
Muchas gracias, especialmente por el detalle y la exhaustiva enumeración de los instrumentos a los que referimos. Este es exactamente el objetivo, que podamos identificar todos los instrumentos que debamos mencionar en nuestra guía de formación para que sean una adecuada referencia de cara a la aplicación del artículo 6 y, en su momento, la prohibición de las operaciones internacionales de comercio de armas que deban ser prohibidas por suponer una violación de dicho artículo. Por lo tanto, el ejercicio es exactamente este, definir con exactitud cuáles son los instrumentos. Por eso agradezco a Suiza que nos haga llegar por escrito su intervención para tener la referencia exacta y que podamos incluir el lenguaje en nuestra guía voluntaria de formación. Animo a las delegaciones a que tomen la palabra porque si no, las 2 horas que me han regalado se van a acabar muy pronto. La delegación de Irlanda tiene la palabra.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In light of the limited time for our discussion, I'll keep my comments brief and focus on Article 6.3, in particular the question surrounding what constitutes knowledge at the time of authorization. In our view, this requirement encompasses constructive as well as actual knowledge. Actual knowledge, to be required in every case, would set an exceedingly high bar. Rarely, if ever, can it be said with absolute certainty that arms would be used to commit atrocity crimes. In our view, the correct interpretation, in line with the object and purpose of the treaty, is that constructive knowledge is sufficient for the Article 6.3 prohibition on transfer to apply. This is in accordance with the ICRC's position that a state party must deny transfer under Article 6.3 if it has substantial grounds to believe, based on information in its possession or that is reasonably available to it, that the weapons would be used to commit genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes. Lastly, Mr. Chair, I would like to just agree with what our colleague from Switzerland said, that we do not need to define concepts such as genocide or crimes against humanity in the voluntary guide, but instead refer to existing international law. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Irlanda, por la clarificación. Quiero recordar que en el ejercicio que hicimos de clarificación de conceptos, llegamos 12 de los estados parte, es decir, la mitad de los que intervinieron dieron una definición muy similar a la que acaba de dar Irlanda. Puede haber diferencias de matiz en el vocabulario, pero una definición bastante precisa y común de qué debemos entender por tener conocimiento, en el sentido de tener la suficiente información de cuál va a ser el destino de las armas que son objeto de la operación. Por lo tanto, creo que estamos ya muy cerca de tener una idea muy concreta de cómo tenemos que reflejar este punto en nuestra guía voluntaria de formación. Abro el espacio para más intervenciones. Lo siento, pero no llevo gafas, entonces no veo bien, pero... USA tiene la palabra los Estados Unidos de América.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator, for giving me the floor. I just wanted to make a couple of brief comments. Regarding what you just said about knowledge and a majority of the states that you've heard from having this, so it's a commonly understood view, I just wanted to emphasize that it's important we keep in mind the negotiating record of the treaty itself in terms of the actual knowledge standard. And it is clear from the negotiating record that for the knowledge standard, that the minimum that you can require states to do is an actual knowledge standard, not a constructive knowledge standard. If states individual states wish to adopt a constructive knowledge standard on a national basis, they are certainly welcome to, but the minimum obligation that's actually in the treaty is an actual knowledge standard. Then also I wanted to make a general comment as we come up with lists of international agreements, relevant international agreements and the like, that we need to be mindful that not all states are state parties to all of these international instruments. And it might be useful to have some sort of caveating language which basically said that potentially relevant international instruments could include the following or something, just to recognize, for example, like it was mentioned, the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention. Not all states parties to the ATT actually are parties to that treaty, and the same is true for some of the other ones out there. So again, it's useful to come up with an illustrative list for states to consider what might be relevant, but just be mindful that not everybody is actually a state party to all these treaties. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señor delegado. Por supuesto, tenemos que tener en cuenta que no estamos dando una recomendación de aplicación, sino unas referencias que pueden ser útiles a los Estados parte para la aplicación, de acuerdo a su acto soberano de consultar esos instrumentos o cualesquiera otros pueda considerar de acuerdo a su legislación nacional. Eso tiene que quedar muy claro. En la guía voluntaria de formación se dan unas pautas para la formación de agentes orientativas, pero que no suponen instrucciones ni recomendaciones de aplicación. Por lo tanto, esa apreciación tiene que quedar muy clara en el sentido de que ningún Estado se puede ver obligado a aplicar una normativa internacional de la que no es parte. Eso es un elemento sustancial, aunque pueda ser una referencia para su consideración. Tenemos a continuación a la delegación del Estado de Palestina.
Mr. Facilitator, at the outset, the State of Palestine would like to thank you for your excellent work as facilitator of this group. We believe that this exercise encourages much-needed information sharing among ATT stakeholders and exemplifies one of the key purposes of the ATT, that is, to promote transparency. We reiterate that national interpretations must be compliant with ATT commitments and with well-established international legal standards. ATT provisions complement existing limits on arms transfer that stem in particular from the obligation to respect and ensure respect for IHL under Article 1 common to the 1949 Geneva Conventions, a key principle of the treaty. As weapons continue to flow to some of the most brutal armed conflicts, responsible arms transfer is a humanitarian imperative, and imposing restraints on such transfers is an essential element of any humanitarian response. Mr. Facilitator, in this spirit, we would like to make general comments first before answering the questions on the updated version of Chapter 1's draft of the elements of a voluntary guide to implementing Articles 6 and 7 of the ATT. First, under the contents section, we recommend including the general rules of interpretation under international law, as the third theme, right after the background and the treaty's text, as the purpose of this exercise is to provide clarity on how states parties approach the key concepts in Articles 6 and 7. We consider it critical to include here the general rule on the interpretation of treaties, as codified in Article 31 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which provides that a treaty has to be interpreted in a good faith, in line with the ordinary meanings of its terms, in their context, and in the light of its object and purpose. Second, with regard with the treaty's text, paragraph 4 of the guide, we recommend inserting the ATT's preamble and Article 1 into this theme, right before Articles 6 and 7. This is because the faithful interpretation and implementation of the ATT requires an understanding of the treaty's underlying aims and objectives. These are set out in the ATT's preamble and Article 1, which constitute the basis on which to interpret the treaty's obligations. Third, we recommend including references to the legal studies issued by neutral international bodies, in particular, the International Committee of the Red Cross Studies on the ATT. Mainly, I quote, understanding the ATT from a humanitarian perspective of 1916 and 1920, and the ICRC study on international humanitarian law and gender-based violence in the context of the Arms Trade Treaty, issued on 2019. Such studies are much needed as they contribute to the development of international humanitarian law and promote respect for it by governments and all arms bearers, and they will give state parties a fuller picture and better understanding of the legal background of these key concepts under international law. Fourth, we recommend sharing the inputs of the 20 states that participated in the exercise on the ATT website. This is needed to ensure transparency and to give an overall picture that will encourage much needed information sharing among ATT stakeholders. Fifth, with regard to paragraph 8, page 9 of the guideline, we believe that the sentence, I quote, "The inclusion of the reference in this document is not intended to apply criminal law standards regarding individual criminal responsibility to these ATT provisions." This sentence should be removed from the guideline. Indeed, this statement contradicts the views expressed by some other state parties, and it will be counterproductive, prejudice the decision of state parties in this regard, given that it does not reflect a common understanding by all state parties. Sixth, moving on to paragraph 16, page 13, under the serious violation of international human rights law, we insist on the importance of referring to the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination and the Apartheid Convention within the list of international instruments. They cannot be left behind. Seventh, with regard to paragraph 17 on the same page, we mentioned that the State of Palestine, its intervention, has mentioned before that the violations of IHRL cover a wide range of rights in accordance with their obligations under international law. States should refrain from transferring arms that affect the enjoyment of fundamental human rights protected under international treaty and customary law, especially Jus Cogens norms. The State of Palestine stresses that situations involving human rights violations should be assessed by the manner in which they were violated and their severity. We believe that the summary should either quote all examples of the Jus Cogens norms provided by the states, or otherwise keep speaking in general terms. The current listing is not adequate to address the obligations that are required by the law. Accordingly, the State of Palestine has provided a non-exhaustive list of violations that are serious, including but not limited to gross and systematic human rights violations. We reaffirm the importance of adding to the list at least the following: the apartheid, discrimination on racial, national, ethnic, linguistic, or religious grounds, violations of the right to self-determination, exemplified by illegal occupation, deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian objects in situations of armed conflict, indiscriminate attacks in situations of armed conflict, forced and large-scale population displacement, exemplified by illegal settlements, violation of the right to life, including murder and massacres and extrajudicial and summary executions, excessive use of force. And it's a long list. I will not take that much time in mentioning, but I keep mentioning blockades, discriminations, forced eviction, restriction on movement, attacks on human rights defenders and journalists, excessive use of force during peaceful demonstrations, direct targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure, firing live bullets at peaceful demonstrations, etc. With regard to page 15, paragraph 25, the State of Palestine indeed supported the International Criminal Court's Office of the Prosecutor position on its policy paper on sexual and gender-based crimes, in which it identifies gender-based violence as violence against persons, whether male or female, because of their sex and or socially constructed gender roles. In this context, we also referred to the ICRC explanation of what forms gender-based violence. In particular, its study entitled International Humanitarian Law and Gender-Based Violence in the Context of the ATT, in which it provides that gender-based violence is not always sexual in nature. It is broader than, but includes sexual violence. Unlawful killing is a serious violation of international humanitarian law and constitutes a serious act of gender-based violence. For example, in some conflicts, military-aged males are the victims of mass killings to prevent them from participating in hostilities. Therefore, we reiterate the importance of including this aspect, which should not be left out of the guideline. With regard to paragraph 34 and 35, page 17 of the guideline, could you please clarify if the wording generally means that most of the 20 states supported the actual knowledge theory? Here we must remind that if we take a look back to the historical background of the treaty, we will see that the other opinion supporting the constructive knowledge approach has been supported by the International Court of Justice and the International Committee of the Red Cross and several states, while the actual knowledge approach has been supported by fewer states. In any case, Article 6, paragraph 3 refers to knowledge that the weapons would be used to commit the listed crimes, indicating a lower burden of evidence to deny the transfer than knowledge that the weapons will be used for such ends. In other words, the level of knowledge required to prohibit a transfer under Article 6, paragraph 3 is not one of absolute certainty. And I can refer to the parallel that can be drawn with the user's guide to the EU Council Comment Position 2008, defining the common rules governing the control of exports of military technology and equipment, which notes that the language might be used in Article 2, Criterion 2 of the Common Position, requires a lower burden of evidence than a clear risk that the military technology or equipment will be used for internal repression. ATT states parties would need to take this interpretation into account in implementing Article 6, paragraph 3 in relation to all the listed crimes as a matter of advancing the humanitarian purpose of the treaty, including ensuring respect of IHL. Therefore, we recommend to delete the word generally to describe the first opinion, because it would give an impression that it's more reliable than the other opinion. Finally, there is a repetition of the list. I quote, "The list is indicative," both in paragraph 16, page 13, and in the citation below in the same page. Therefore, we think that this sentence is not needed in this page, as it has already been clarified in paragraph 2, page 9 of the guideline. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a la delegación de Palestina por su intervención. Sin duda, los estudios de organizaciones independientes son de una gran utilidad a la hora de definir nuestros conceptos. Ha citado usted el de la Cruz Roja, el Comité Internacional de la Cruz Roja. Quiero llamarles la atención también sobre el manual elaborado hace unos años publicado por Small Arms Survey como manual de aplicación del tratado, donde se recoge precisamente todos los elementos que podemos utilizar para responder estas cuestiones. De nuevo, esto es únicamente una referencia para la utilidad de la aplicación, no una recomendación de que se hayan de seguir esos criterios. Cabe además destacar que la mayoría de los estados, en su participación en el cuestionario que elaboramos hace ya 2 años, subrayaron que en la mayoría de los casos se analizan las situaciones caso por caso, en la individualidad de cada uno de ellos, porque, como bien ha citado en este caso la delegación de Palestina, hay diferentes niveles de conocimiento, diferentes formaciones del conocimiento que no pueden ser homogéneas en una operación cuando distinguimos una operación de otra. Por lo tanto, cada una de las operaciones que se somete a examen para ver si debe prohibirse o no es un universo en sí mismo. El conocimiento es el que se refiere exactamente a esa operación y lo que tenemos que tener es los recursos disponibles para su valoración en nuestra legislación nacional, en la legislación internacional, en los manuales, guías o directrices elaborados bien sea por la Unión Europea o por otras instituciones, pero la autoridad que debe emitir una decisión sobre la operación lo que tiene es que tener los recursos disponibles para poder tomar la decisión adecuada, que se referirá exactamente a las circunstancias de esa operación, sin que se pueda generalizar a otras. Eso debemos tenerlo muy en cuenta y así estará recogido en la guía de formación, porque ha sido uno de los elementos principales de coincidencia de los estados que participaron en el intercambio de mejores prácticas. Por lo tanto, debemos siempre considerar que de cara a la formación de nuestros agentes que han de tomar las decisiones, se trata principalmente de que conozcan los recursos que tienen a su disposición para hacer la valoración de acuerdo a los elementos que conlleve la documentación de la operación que es objeto de examen. Ese es el momento clave en el que se aplica su conocimiento. Tenemos una nueva intervención, no distingo quién, pero si se presenta anticipadamente. ICRC. El Comité Internacional de la Cruz Roja tiene la palabra.
Thank you very much. The International Committee of the Red Cross welcomes the work undertaken by the sub-working group on a potential voluntary guide on Articles 6 and 7. And we'd also like to express our thanks to you, Ambassador Sanchez, for facilitating this work. Now, in line with our mandate and our mission to prevent suffering by promoting and strengthening humanitarian law and universal humanitarian principles, the ICRC has offered some comments on the draft elements, and we'd be grateful if these could be made publicly available on the ATT website. And we would also like to express our thanks to you, facilitator, for reflecting these comments in the revised version. I'll reserve our remarks on Article 6.3 for a later point. At this stage, I would simply like to say that in the view of the ICRC, a potential voluntary guide should provide practice-oriented guidance to states parties in their endeavor to establish the highest possible common international standards for regulating or improving the regulation of the international trade in conventional weapons, and facilitate progress towards realizing the ATT's humanitarian objective. And so to this end, it would seem to us that such a guide could ideally identify the sorts of questions that typically arise from the practical application of Articles 6 and 7. So the practical application on a case-by-case basis, as you've just said, Mr. Facilitator, to concrete arms transfer decisions. So it could include decontextualized case studies based on real-world experiences that illustrate the very real challenges that states parties are faced with in practice, and identify, ideally, concrete measures that states parties have developed over time or are thinking about, contemplating, trying out to address these challenges, which are likely shared challenges shared by other states parties. We'd also like to echo the point made earlier that such a guide could benefit from building on and further developing work that has already been carried out in the framework of the ATT, but also outside of it by diverse stakeholders. The guide could cross-reference these existing resources and or perhaps even take up some of the recommendations already articulated. And ideally, such a guide would be a living document from our perspective so that new insights can be added on an open-ended basis. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias al Comité Internacional de la Cruz Roja y especialmente a las aportaciones que nos hizo por escrito para mejorar la guía. Como decimos, la guía es un trabajo de todos en el que tenemos que construir para preparar el documento más completo posible. He dejado una cuestión anterior sin contestar sobre la transparencia y la posibilidad de publicar las aportaciones que hicieron los estados en el intercambio de mejores prácticas. Y es porque muchos de ellos han manifestado su deseo de mantenerlo en la reserva, ya que es el caso también de España. Las reuniones de la Junta Nacional que autoriza o no las operaciones de comercio de armas y de material de doble uso se celebran bajo secreto. Por lo tanto, no puede publicarse el contenido o la racionalización de las decisiones de las mismas. hay que entender esta sensibilidad a la hora de aprobar las decisiones, porque la legislación nacional puede imponer restricciones, como es el caso de mi país, para dar publicidad a los procedimientos que se aplican. No obstante, en el marco de la transparencia y con el fin de ser lo más transparentes posibles, los Estados partes siempre pueden publicar informes nacionales sobre cómo están aplicando su legislación o hacer públicos, como es el caso de mi país también, los informes nacionales que presentan al Tratado de Comercio de Armas. Tenemos la intervención de la Unión Europea.
Muchas gracias, señor facilitador. Y primeramente, la Unión Europea desea agradecerle a usted, señor embajador Sánchez de Lerín, por el trabajo continuo sobre este tema específicamente importante en el contexto del tratado. The EU sees Articles 6 and 7 as really the core of the treaty, most of all, of course, in terms of obligations to exporting states, parties, and the effective treaty implementation begins and ends with the serious risk assessment that are being conducted by exporting countries under these articles. We would encourage the states parties, therefore, to continue the work on your voluntary best practice guidance document with a view to finalize it as soon as possible. The document could indeed be a useful tool when assessing arms export license applications. And while these risk assessments under Article 7 remain a national prerogative to be carried out on a case-by-case basis, as also mentioned by you, Mr. Facilitator, the exchange of good practices amongst states parties can have an added value for all of us. Finally, we would also like to draw the attention of states parties to Article 6, paragraph 3. A state party shall not authorize any transfer of conventional arms if it has knowledge at the time of authorization that the arms or items would be used in the commission of genocide, crimes against humanity, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions of 1949, attacks directed against civilian objects or civilians protected as such, or other war crimes as defined by international agreements to which it is a party. When reading this article and facing the current situation of the war in Ukraine, the EU feels that exporting arms in the current context to Russia would not be permitted under the ATT. As a result of the Russian Federation's unprovoked, unjustified military aggression against Ukraine, and given the many grave breaches by Russia of the Geneva Conventions, including continuous deliberate attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. Thank you, Mr. Facilitator.
Muchas gracias al delegado de la Unión Europea por su intervención. Tiene la palabra la delegación de MAT for Peace.
شكرا سيادة الميسر. الصوت واضح؟ شكرا سيادة الميسر. انصب الاهتمام الدولي على التوافر المتزايد للأسلحة الصغيرة والخفيفة منخفضة التكلفة، على الرغم من أن هذه النزاعات غالبا ما تكون لها جذور عميقة ومعقدة، إلا أن التوافر الواسع النطاق للأسلحة الخفيفة الحديثة قد تشجع المتحاربين على متابعة أهدافهم في ساحة المعركة وليس على طاولة المفاوضات، وخاصة في ظل ظهور قدرة محلية في العديد من الدول بما في ذلك عشرات الدول النامية أو أكثر على تصنيع هذه الأسلحة، فلم يعد تصنيعها والإتجار فيها مقتصر فقط على الدول الصناعية الكبرى، حيث تنتج العديد من الدول النامية أسلحة التصدير وكذلك الاستخدام المحلي، مما يضيف بشكل كبير إلى عدد المصادر التي يمكن لأي محارب محتل الحصول منها على أسلحة الحرب. من ثم لا توجد دولة محصنة من التحديات التي تطرحها تدفقات الأسلحة الغير مشروعة، وخاصة أن الأسلحة الصغيرة والأسلحة الخفيفة هي الأكثر استخداما في النزاعات بين الدول وفي الإرهاب وفي الجريمة المنظمة وحرب العصابات. يمكن القول أن العديد من الأزمات الأمن الحالية والماضية تفاقمت جميعها بسبب توافر الأسلحة الصغيرة والخفيفة والذخيرة على نطاق واسع بلا ضوابط، فعلى سبيل المثال يعد التدفق المستمر للأسلحة والذخيرة هي المغزى الأساسي للصراع في جنوب السودان والسودان نفسها. كما يظل استخدام الأسلحة المتفجرة خصوصا في المناطق المأهولة تهديدا مستمرا ومتزايدا على الأطفال وأسرهم. ووفقا للإحصائيات التي رصدتها اليونيسيف خلال عام 2020 كانت الأسلحة المتفجرة والمخلفات المتفجرة من الحروب يعني موزعة بأكثر من 50% من جميع من على الأطفال، مما أدى إلى تجنيد عدد كبير من الأطفال واستخدامهم في الحروب، وتجاوزت نسبة هذه الحالات ل 50% في الصومال وجمهورية الكونغو الديمقراطية وجمهورية أفريقيا والوسطى. لذلك نستغل تلك الفرصة ونثمن على الجهود المبذولة في إعداد ذلك الدليل الطوعي ونرحب بجميع الجهود المبذولة في إطار تعزيز المعرفة والوعي ونشر المعلومات للحد من الإتجار الغير مشروع بتلك الأسلحة. ونريد أن نقترح بعض النقاط للدليل الطوعي كإضافة اتفاقية التمييز العنصري، إضافة استخدام الاستهداف المقصود والهجمات العشوائية للمدنيين والأعيان المدنية والإعدام خارج نطاق القضاء واستخدام القوى المفرطة. وأيضا نرى أن هناك ضرورة لوضع تعريف الإبادة الجماعية وفقا لما أشارت إليه اتفاقية الإبادة الجماعية والنظام روما الأساسي. حتى الآن سيدي ميسر يتم انتهاك القانون الدولي الإنساني وتنتهك جميع الاتفاقيات، فطالما نقوم حاليا بتعزيز المعرفة والوعي وإعداد دليل طوعي فنرى أن هناك فرصة لطرح جميع التعريفات التي تتمكن الدول الأطراف من استخدامها. ونريد أيضا أن نشير إلى أن أرسلنا جميع المداخلات إلى الأمانة العامة بالأمس. شكرا سيدي ميسر.
Muchas gracias por su intervención. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Japón. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Japón. Japan.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Mr. Facilitator, Japan would like to begin by expressing its sincere appreciation to you, Ambassador Sanchez, a facilitator of the sub-working group on Article 6 and 7, for your precious efforts as facilitator leading to substantive progress in the work of this sub-working group. Under the current international security circumstances, controlling arms transfers and ensuring the implementation of the Arms Trade Treaty has become even more critical. In this sense, Japan attaches great importance to the role of the Working Group on Effective Treaty Implementation as a forum to share national practices and to discuss tangible steps for further enhancement of the implementation of the ATT. Mr. Facilitator, Japan would also like to thank you for presenting the revised draft of the Voluntary Guide, Chapter 1. Japan welcomes the revised version, which duly reflects comments and suggestions made in the previous sessions by state parties, including by those by Japan, and clearly indicates that the nature of the lists are non-exhaustive and that others may also be relevant in several paragraphs. We also support the very concept of the current draft guide, which consists of a compilation of the views and inputs from state parties as a reference and does not include any definitions of each term. Bearing in mind that the purpose of this voluntary guide is to be used as a reference to assist state parties in implementing Article 6 and 7, and in particular, the export control authorities of each state, we need to continue to proceed with caution, not to create new norms and standards for the subsequent discussions on the following chapters. Lastly, as it is the first time I take the floor, allow me to congratulate the Philippines for their ratification of the ATT on 24th of March this year, and for becoming the 111th state party and the first ASEAN member state to join the treaty. Japan warmly welcomes the Philippines as a new state party from Asia-Pacific region and appreciates its efforts to complete the ratification process. To promote and strengthen the effectiveness of the ATT, further universalization is necessary. Japan hopes the voluntary guide, on which we are now deliberating, will contribute also to promoting universalization and enhancing the implementation of the ATT. Thank you for your kind attention, Mr. Facilitator.
Muchas gracias, Japón, por su intervención. Tiene la palabra la organización Control for Arms.
Excellencies and distinguished colleagues, Control Arms thanks you, Mr. Facilitator, for your continued diligence in addressing these critical issues at the heart of the ATT. Of particular concern at this moment is the situation in Ukraine, specifically the way it relates to the effective implementation of both Articles 6 and 7. Troubling reports are emerging from Ukraine on a daily basis. A woman in a village west of Kyiv told Amnesty International that on 9 March, 2 Russian soldiers entered her house, killed her husband, then raped her at gunpoint while her young son hid in a boiler room. The woman was able to escape from the village to Ukrainian-controlled territory with her son. This is just one example of the deliberate killings, gender-based violence, and widespread intimidation by Russian forces against unarmed civilians documented across the Kyiv region. Deeply disturbing is the discovery of mass graves and evidence pointing to summary executions of civilians by Russian forces in Bucha and other areas near Kyiv. Further, OHCHR indicated last week that Russian armed forces have indiscriminately shelled and bombed populated areas, killing civilians and wrecking hospitals, schools, and other civilian infrastructure, actions that may amount to war crimes. As the EU noted earlier, Control Arms believes a rigorous application of ATT Articles 6 and 7 should stop all transfers of arms or related equipment to Russia, whether under new or existing contracts, that could facilitate the commission of war crimes or other serious violations of international humanitarian law by Russian forces in Ukraine. While Control Arms recognizes Ukraine's legitimate right of self-defense, it is vital, even in these circumstances, that ATT states parties transferring arms to Ukraine apply the treaty's provisions in full, in particular, conducting due diligence in the application of Articles 6 and 7. To demonstrate the strength and utility of the ATT in this challenging time, we call on all ATT states parties to share with this forum the ways in which they are maintaining their ATT obligations when assessing whether to authorize arms transfers into the current conflict in Ukraine. With regard to the voluntary guide, Control Arms recognizes the efforts of this sub-working group to complete the first chapter, which reflects comments from various stakeholders on the latest draft. We can see progress in clarifying the purpose and character of the voluntary guide, including the recognition that the list of legal instruments is not exhaustive and reflects the views of specific states parties, rather than any common understanding among them. Clarity is also provided in terms of the aim of Chapter 1, which is not to reinterpret concepts that have established interpretations in international law. Some outstanding issues still require further attention. The voluntary guide should clearly indicate that the information collected in Chapter 1 consists of survey responses provided by anonymous stakeholders, none of which has been reviewed or analyzed for validity or accuracy. In the absence of such consideration, Control Arms is concerned that the voluntary guide could undermine existing international legal norms. For key concepts that do not have existing or accepted legal definitions, we are not persuaded that the responses so far are adequate to provide sufficient guidance. We suggest that the sub-working group consider other approaches that states parties could use to further explore and elaborate these concepts. With regard to the anonymity of responses, Control Arms notes that the names of survey respondents, be they states parties, civil society, or others, are not included in Chapter 1 of the voluntary guide. Control Arms seeks clarity on why the inputs of states parties to the voluntary guide are anonymous. Given that transparency is a key purpose of the ATT, we see value in attaching the content of each input with its source. In doing so, states seeking to gain a deeper understanding of these key concepts could benefit from the ability to engage individual respondents in further discussions. Also in this regard, we support ICRC's point to focus the guide on practical experiences, as these are useful to all states parties to establish the highest possible common standard for the international trade of conventional weapons. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Muchas gracias por su intervención y querría hacer una clarificación sobre esos conceptos que no tienen una definición legal ya establecida. Precisamente la opción que tomamos fue la de, a través de un intercambio de mejores prácticas, llegar a una comprensión de cómo los diferentes estados están aplicando estos conceptos con el fin de que podamos saber si hay una mayor o menor homogeneidad o un mayor o menor entendimiento común de los mismos, lo que se ha producido en ese intercambio de mejores prácticas. Es decir, nos hemos orientado a la aplicación real del tratado. Sugería usted que puede haber otros métodos, otras posibilidades, y en ese sentido lo que hago es invitarle, no en este momento, porque no es necesario que se haga ahora, pero a que nos haga llegar cuáles son sus apreciaciones de qué otros métodos o recursos podemos aplicar para definir mejor esos conceptos que no tienen una definición legal, más allá de la aplicación real que están haciendo los estados, como un ejercicio de contribución o aportación efectiva a nuestro trabajo. En este momento, más adelante, por escrito, cuando quieran, estamos siempre dispuestos a acoger esas nuevas contribuciones, aunque partimos de la base, como dice también, de cara a lo que debe servir la guía, a basarnos en la aplicación real y efectiva del tratado, a tener una perspectiva pragmática de cómo estamos aplicando el tratado. Por eso mismo hemos buscado en el intercambio de mejores prácticas el ejemplo de cómo los estados están interpretando los conceptos que no tienen una definición legal establecida. Tiene la palabra la Coalition for Limitation of Armaments. Se supone que están conectados en red y que están pidiendo la palabra.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Modératrice. Merci beaucoup. Dans un premier temps, nous remercions le groupe de travail et le secrétariat pour les efforts qu'ils ont déployés pour coordonner le cycle préparatoire. Et nous sommes très ravis pour la participation de la coalition mondiale pour la limitation des armements après l'annonce du cycle préparatoire. En tant qu'alliance d'organisations de la société civile d'Afrique, d'Asie, d'Europe et de l'Amérique latine, nous nous sommes tous réunis pour mobiliser et renforcer les conventions et traités internationaux visant à réduire la prolifération des armes. Monsieur le Président, le 2 avril 2013, l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies a adopté le traité sur le trafic des armes classiques afin de réglementer le commerce international des armes classiques en établissant les normes internationales les plus élevées pour la prévention, l'élimination et l'élimination des commerces illicites des armes classiques, ainsi pour les conventions élimination des armes classiques. Le traité sur le trafic d'armes est le premier traité dans lequel les droits de l'homme et les préoccupations humanitaires sont profondément intégrés dans les conventions mondiales sur la maîtrise de la prolifération des armes, en présent l'idée responsable dans le commerce mondial des armes ont été absents jusqu'à présent. Certaines lois régionales et nationales et les exportations n'ont pas inclus ces considérations et les autres ne sont pas inclus. Ce sont les failles qui ont permis aux armes de tomber entre les mauvaises mains d'être détournées vers le marché noir. Le traité sur le commerce des armes est censé contribuer à l'égalité des chances et combler les lacunes utilisées pour les marchands d'armes et les gouvernements. En vertu du traité, les États parties en signataires du traité sont confirmés aux articles 6, 7, 9 et 11, selon lesquels le transfert des armes classiques dont ils connaissent à l'avance ne devrait pas être utilisé dans la violation des droits de l'homme, ce que les faits n'autorisent aucun transfert d'armes classiques prévu dans les traités si le transfert violerait les obligations des États en vertu des mesures adoptées par le Conseil de sécurité de l'ONU, conformément au chapitre 7 de la Charte des Nations Unies, en particulier les mesures de non-approvisionnement armes, autre obligation de ne pas exporter ces armes des États parties exportateurs prouve qu'il existe un risque élevé de quelconque l'effet négatif visé au paragraphe 1 de l'article 7. D'autres parties au traité ont également élaboré des directives à l'intention des pays importateurs d'armes et demandant aux importateurs et aux exportateurs de coopérer à l'échange d'informations pour évaluer l'utilisation des armes. Il comprend également des obligations envers des États qui ont des armes qui franchissent leurs frontières et des activités courtage. Son engagement en faveur des contrôles en transit, des mesures visant à prévenir le transfert des armes lorsque les normes élevées énoncées dans l'article mentionné dans le traité visant à garantir que les armes ne finissent pas dans les mains de ceux qui peuvent l'utiliser pour commettre des graves violations des droits humanitaires et les droits de l'homme ou pour commettre des actes graves de violation sexiste. Tous les décideurs, y compris les hauts fonctionnaires, doivent appliquer ces articles en manière cohérente, objective et non discriminatoire. Les normes de souffrance humanitaire dans le conflit à travers le monde imposent à tous les États nécessaires absolus d'adhérer au traité sur le commerce des armes et de répondre fidèlement à leurs exigences selon les normes les plus élevées. Mais la réalité est tout le contraire, car les pays exportateurs d'armes et les parties au traité n'ont pas respecté ces obligations qu'ils vendent des armes à des pays, en particulier dans les zones du conflit armé. La prévention de transfert des armes également un défi mondial, en particulier dans la zone du conflit armé, et les armes légères de petit calibre entrent souvent en circulation illégale au niveau local par le baïs de dons, des vols, etc. L'Alliance mondiale pour la réduction et l'imitation des armes souligne donc que l'accord commercial climatique fondé sur les principes pertinents des droits et les normes internationaux doit être pierre angulaire d'un effort mondial visant à, premièrement, faire avantage pour élargir l'activation des obligations des États et en vertu des traités sur le commerce des armes applique effectivement l'article 6, 7, 9 et 11. Mettre en place un mécanisme juridique complet et inclusif fondé sur les normes internationales élevées dans la réglementation des transactions commerciales dans ce domaine. Deuxièmement, les États devraient convenir d'un mécanisme de suivi d'application qui prévoit une enquête rapide, impartiale et transparente sur la violation présumée du traité sur le commerce des armes, des sanctions appropriées contre les contrevenants. Troisièmement, prévenir les transferts irresponsables d'armes classiques et tenir compte de possibilités d'utiliser des armes dans le cadre de violences ou de violences graves fondées sur le genre à l'égard des femmes et des enfants. Quatrième et enfin, l'importance de contrôler le commerce des armes, en particulier dans les zones de conflit armés, et activer le contrôle des transits des armes et transfert des armes irresponsables peuvent déstabiliser toute une région, permettre de violation de l'embargo sur des armes et contribuer à la violation des droits de l'homme et le trafic des armes légitimes et illégales par le baïs des marchés noirs et exacerber les conflits internationaux et les guerres civiles. Merci, Madame la modératrice.
Merci beaucoup pour votre intervention. Cedo la palabra a la organización ASER, A-S-E-R.
Merci, Monsieur le modérateur. Nous tenons à vous féliciter pour la tenue du travail préparatif à cette PrepCom, ainsi que le secrétariat qui en a permis sa réalisation. Nous soutenons les propositions présentées par la Suisse. Nous souhaiterions que soient précisés dans les moyens d'avoir connaissance les rapports d'experts des Nations Unies, les rapports des ONG et de la société civile et les rapports parlementaires. Nous partageons la déclaration du représentant de l'Union européenne sur l'application de l'article 6, paragraphe 3, à propos de la guerre en Ukraine et de la nécessité de suspendre les exportations d'armes en direction de la Russie. Par contre, nous sommes surpris de voir que les États les plus engagés dans le respect de cet article 6, paragraphe 2, en direction de la Russie, se retrouvent être les principaux exportateurs d'armes vers les pays de la coalition impliqués dans la guerre au Yémen et dirigés par l'Arabie saoudite et les Émirats arabes unis, comme les États-Unis, l'Espagne, la France, la Grande-Bretagne et l'Italie. Cette coalition dirigée par l'Arabie saoudite et les Émirats arabes unis, responsable de crimes de guerre et de crimes contre l'humanité contre la population yéménite. C'est un signe terrible, nous semble-t-il, qui est envoyé à l'encontre des populations de la planète et qui va à l'encontre du cœur de notre travail ici, qui est assurer une application non discriminatoire des articles 6 et 7 du traité sur le commerce des armes. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le modérateur.
Muchas gracias por su intervención. Tiene la palabra de nuevo la delegación de Palestina, del Estado de Palestina.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. With this statement, we would like to provide our interpretation on the mentioned concepts provided under the scope of Article 6. With respect to the first question, we agree with Switzerland's answer, and we affirm that Article 6 applies to all forms of transfer referred to in Article 2, Paragraph 2 of the treaty, exports, imports, transit or transshipment, and brokering. With respect to the second question, we reiterate that under Article 25 of the UN Charter, and in accordance with the UN Charter, each UN member state is required to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council. Under Article 41, contained in Chapter 7 of the Charter, the Council may decide what measures not involving the use of armed force are to be employed to give effect to its decisions, and it may call upon the members of the UN to apply such measures. These may include complete or partial interruption of economic relations. An arms embargo is therefore a complete or partial interruption of economic relations with respect to the transfer of weapons. Since each UN member state is already required to respect a Security Council embargo, this provision reiterates an existing obligation. We restate that measures other than arms embargo adopted by the Security Council under Chapter 7 can be relevant here. In addition, these obligations concern all actions with respect to threats to the peace, breaches of the peace, and acts of aggression, according to Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. ATT states parties should act responsibly when dealing with states involved in the violation and disrespect of the Security Council resolutions. This is particularly important in case of prolonged conflicts and active conflicts, where arms trade will only serve to fuel conflicts and lead to further the conflicts instead of resolving them. Regarding the last question, the scope of relevant international obligations under international agreements to which it is party is potentially very broad. The term in particular signals that the provision covers more general international and regional instruments in addition to those that directly address the transfer of or illicit trafficking in conventional arms. Therefore, we reiterate that Article 6, Paragraph 2 incorporate human rights treaties to which a state party to the ATT is a party. Such reading is consistent with the principles 5 and 6 of the preamble section of the ATT. We consider at least the following international obligations as relevant under Article 6, Paragraph 2. These are the UN Charter, Geneva Conventions, regional and international human rights treaties, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons and its protocols, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crimes. In addition, states must take into account the prohibitions under customary international law and the jus cogens and erga omnes rules, which continue to apply independently of the ATT. Thank you, Mr. President.
Muchas gracias por las nuevas aportaciones de la delegación del Estado de Palestina. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Francia. La France, vous avez la parole.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le facilitateur. Et tout d'abord, permettez-moi de vous remercier pour la documentation que vous avez transmise en amont de cette réunion et pour la présentation de vos propositions suite aux travaux menés dans le cadre de l'échange de vues et d'informations sur les pratiques nationales s'agissant de la mise en œuvre des concepts clés figurant aux articles 6 et 7 du traité. Comme vous le savez, la France a contribué à ces travaux en rappelant ses pratiques nationales en la matière qui se fondent sur une évaluation au cas par cas, fruit d'un examen interministériel et de sources d'informations variées, tenant compte de plusieurs facteurs, dont le contexte et les circonstances dans le cadre desquelles s'inscrivent l'exportation envisagée, la destination finale, de même que l'utilisateur final et l'utilisation finale, mais également la nature, le type et la quantité de matériel concerné. La position de la France est bien connue, Monsieur le facilitateur. Je vais simplement très brièvement la rappeler. Nous considérons que ce guide a pour unique objet de dresser un panorama des pratiques nationales, identifier des options possibles pour rapprocher ces concepts, sans chercher à imposer d'interprétation unique de ces derniers, dans le respect de la lettre et de l'esprit du traité. La France se tient prête à contribuer aux travaux menés dans le cadre de ce sous-groupe de travail, qui doivent viser à encourager l'échange d'informations entre les États parties sur la manière dont ils mettent en œuvre, à titre national, les articles 6 et 7 du traité. Et nous tenons, Monsieur le facilitateur, à vous remercier pour les efforts très importants que vous menez à ces fins. Je vous remercie.
Muchas gracias a la delegación de Francia por el apoyo que está prestando a este proceso. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Ghana. Ghana, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Facilitator. And let me congratulate you for the good work you have done so far and the excellent nature in which your draft document seems to be emerging. Let me also thank the Secretariat for the hard work they put in this and especially making these meetings possible after the long break as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And also congratulate China and Philippines for joining the treaties. I'd like to say thank you for coming on board. Mr. Facilitator, whilst it's important that the guide would be a voluntary one, there is no gainsaying that it may become the basis for implementation for some states, and for that matter, a basis for decision whether to approve or reject a particular transfer request. Reading through the draft document for the voluntary guide for implementing Articles 6 and 7 of the ATT, it is clear that states that responded to the survey made references to international laws and other treaties and instruments that they are parties to. It is also obvious that not all state parties of the ATT are parties to some of the treaties and instruments under reference in the draft guide. It is pretty clear that sometimes states refuse or do not want to be part of a particular treaty or instrument because of one or two clauses or articles that they disagree with or do not find comfortable, and not the entirety of the particular treaty or instrument. Consequently, we would like to suggest that instead of wholesale reference to the existing treaties or instruments, states should consider specific definitions of concepts in those treaties and instruments, and then those definitions and concepts are probably brought for consideration and adoption into the guide. I thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a la delegación de Ghana, también por sus agradables palabras dirigidas a este facilitador, igual que han hecho otras delegaciones. Quiero subrayar en este punto, agradeciendo mucho su apoyo y sus buenas palabras hacia mi función, que la sustancia del trabajo a quien tenemos que agradecérsela es sobre todo a la Secretaría, sin cuyo apoyo no seríamos capaces, yo al menos no sería capaz de presentar la documentación que les presentamos. El trabajo de la Secretaría es fundamental para que podamos avanzar por su conocimiento específico y por la dedicación que le dan, mucho más que el mío propio, que no estoy centrado únicamente en el tratado, sino que cumplo otras muchas funciones. Una clarificación con respecto a la clara aportación de Ghana en ese aspecto que tenemos que considerar cuando un Estado no es parte de uno de los instrumentos legales a los que nos referimos. Como bien ha mencionado el delegado ganés, puede ser porque ese instrumento internacional contenga alguna cláusula que genera un problema al Estado en cuestión. Pero eso no quiere decir que el Estado pueda dejar de considerar el resto del tratado por considerarlo válido y útil. Por lo tanto, vuelvo a subrayar ese aspecto. Cuando hagamos un listado de documentos o de tratados internacionales que podemos considerar a la hora de aplicar el tratado, es siempre de modo referencial, de modo práctico, para que los Estados puedan acudir a ellos en aquellos aspectos que consideren útiles, en su integridad o parcialmente, de acuerdo a su legislación nacional y en el ejercicio de su soberanía. Por lo tanto, no es impedimento que un Estado no sea parte de un determinado instrumento para que pueda en algún momento considerar útil alguna de sus apreciaciones en la aprobación o denegación de una de las operaciones. Muchas gracias, Ghana, por esta precisión importante. Tiene la palabra la delegación de México.
Sí, buenas tardes. ¿Me puede escuchar, señor presidente?
Muy bien, le escuchamos muy bien.
Muchas gracias. Primero quisiera reconocer y agradecer el liderazgo y la flexibilidad de la presidencia y el secretariado para ajustar las labores a formatos que den viabilidad a la participación más nutrida posible de las partes y esquemas de seguimiento oportuno sobre los acuerdos que anteceden a las reuniones y aquellos nuevos que se van alcanzando. México observa muy positivamente que la octava conferencia de las partes profundizará en el debate sobre la implementación efectiva del tratado. En este sentido, México desea destacar el ánimo de fortalecer la cooperación internacional para construir capacidades alrededor de la implementación efectiva de este instrumento. Queremos reconocer y agradecer los esfuerzos realizados por usted, señor embajador Sánchez de Lerín, respecto a la lista de posibles elementos para el capítulo 1 de la guía voluntaria. Consideramos que los trabajos van por buen camino y que dichos elementos ayudarán a los Estados partes en su implementación de los artículos 6 y 7. Asimismo, con relación a los artículos 6 y 7 del tratado, además de los aspectos relacionados con violaciones a los derechos humanos y al derecho internacional humanitario, identificados como elementos clave para la instrumentación de dichos artículos, consideramos que es necesario profundizar los riesgos asociados al acceso de la delincuencia organizada hacia las armas y las municiones en el ciclo del comercio, incluso por el relajamiento de controles desde la industria exportadora. Y por último, si bien nos vamos a referir a ello cuando discutamos sobre la universalización, queremos extender nuestra felicitación a Filipinas por su reciente acceso al tratado para ser el miembro número 111 del ATT. Bueno, muchas gracias, presidente. Eso es todo.
Muchas gracias, México, por su intervención y precisamente ahora damos la palabra a la delegación de Filipinas en lo que será su primera intervención en el marco del tratado, en el que les damos nuestra más cordial bienvenida. Filipinas tiene la palabra.
Mr. Facilitator, we first wish to thank you for your excellent work as facilitator of this group. And with this statement, we would like to note some of the Philippines' ongoing efforts in the implementation of the Arms Trade Treaty. Thank you for the other states who welcomed us to this treaty. On March 24 of this year, the Philippines ratified the treaty, and it will come into force for us on June 22 of this year. Our preparations for its implementation started in November of 2015 when our legislature approved the Strategic Trade Management Act, which forms the basis of the Philippines' national control system. It is supported by the Comprehensive Firearms Act and the Customs Management and Tariff Act. The ATT assessment criteria under Article 6 and 7.1 is already embedded in our domestic law and its implementing rules and regulations. As a result, if there is a substantial risk of any of the negative consequences listed in Article 7.1 and Article 7.4, the Strategic Trade Management Office or the Philippine National Police Firearms and Explosives Office, which are both responsible for the issuance of export and import permits for conventional weapons, are required to deny the permit application. We view our recent ratification of the ATT as an opportunity to further enhance our trade controls and therefore choose to apply the ATT criteria not only to proposed exports, imports, brokering, transit, or transshipment of ATT items, but also to all dual-use items. Further, we welcome the collaborative approach in the development of the voluntary guide to implementing Articles 6 and 7 of the treaty, which will help the Philippines in its implementation as well. Mr. Facilitator, with this information, we would like to assure you and the Presidency of our full support throughout this meeting and in your efforts leading up to the 8th Conference of the States Parties. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Filipinas, por su aportación al tratado, que esperamos que sea muy sustantiva. Tengo a continuación las intervenciones de Georgia, seguido de la República de Corea y de Argentina. Tras estas tres delegaciones, vamos a dar la palabra a la delegación del Comité Internacional de la Cruz Roja, que va a hacer una breve presentación precisamente en torno al concepto de conocimiento, knowledge. Si hay otras delegaciones que quieren después tomar la palabra, tomaré nota de ello, con el fin de que lleguemos al término de nuestra reunión puntualmente. Georgia tiene la palabra.
First of all, I would like to thank the ATT Secretariat for giving me an opportunity to attend this preparatory meeting. I also want to thank you, Mr. Facilitator, for giving me the floor. The main aim of my state in a decision-making process is not to authorize any transfer of conventional arms if it has knowledge that the arms would be used in the commission of genocide, crimes against humanity, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions of 1949, attacks directed against civilian objects or civilians protected as such, or other war crimes as defined by international agreements to which Georgia is a party. Also takes into account relevant factors, including information provided by the importing state in accordance with Article 8.1, assess the potential that the conventional arms or items would contribute to or undermine peace and security, could be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law, commit or facilitate a serious violation of international human rights law, commit or facilitate an act constituting an offense under international conventions or protocols relating to terrorism and transnational organized crime to which Georgia is a party. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Georgia, por su aportación. Tiene la palabra la delegación de la República de Corea.
Thank you for giving me the floor, Ambassador. I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to Ambassador Goebel and the ATT Secretariat for their devotion to organizing this meeting. The Republic of Korea appreciates the facilitators' continuous efforts to faithfully reflect the opinions of the state parties and civil society presented during the last meeting with regard to the draft elements of the voluntary guide to implementing Articles 6 and 7. We believe that this guide will be another helpful reference for interested states parties when conducting risk assessment prior to authorizing export and interpreting Articles 6 and 7. With regard to the obligations in Article 6, the Republic of Korea has established a system ensuring its compliance by incorporating the obligations under measures adopted by the United Nations Security Council, in particular arms embargoes, into its domestic laws and regulations. The laws and regulations governing the national export control system, such as the Foreign Trade Act, include the control lists and obligations under the multilateral control regimes and international agreements to which the Republic of Korea is a party. Therefore, the licensing authorities assess whether an export violates any of those obligations in accordance with the relevant laws and regulations before making a decision on an export authorization, and do not authorize the export if it is deemed that the export would violate any obligation. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a la delegación de la República de Corea. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Argentina.
Muchas gracias, señor facilitador. Por ser esta nuestra primera intervención, permítanos agradecerle a usted por su liderazgo y por la labor realizada al frente de este subgrupo y reiterarle el pleno apoyo de nuestra delegación. También quisiéramos agradecer al presidente de la 8ª Conferencia de Estados Parte, el embajador Goebel de Alemania, y a la Secretaría de la organización por las reuniones de esta semana. Y asimismo, permítanme transmitir el aprecio de mi país, tanto a la Secretaría como a los coordinadores del programa de patrocinio, por concederme la posibilidad de participar en persona y trabajar más eficazmente en pos de los objetivos del tratado. Señor facilitador, mi delegación apoya la lista revisada del posible proyecto de elementos para el capítulo 1, relativo a conceptos clave de la guía de uso voluntario, que a nuestro entender ofrece indicadores útiles a la hora de interpretar el tratado. Al respecto, quisiéramos sumarnos a lo señalado por algunas delegaciones sobre la necesidad de que a la hora de mencionar cuál sería la normativa internacional aplicable, se aclare que la misma solo es aplicable a aquellos estados que son parte de esa legislación internacional. Aunque, como usted bien ha aclarado, señor facilitador, ningún estado parte se encuentra obligado por tratados o convenios que no ha suscrito. Por otra parte, compartimos lo indicado por algunas delegaciones sobre la necesidad de incluir normativa perteneciente al derecho internacional de derechos humanos. Permítanos ahora hacer un comentario más general sobre el artículo 7.4 y la violencia basada en el género. Consideramos que parte de los desafíos en este punto se deben a distintas capacidades, indicadores y mecanismos de los países para medir el impacto de género. Como contribución a ese objetivo, la Argentina hará una propuesta que va a resumir a continuación mi colega de la Agencia Nacional de Materiales Controlados, ANMAC, quien se encuentra participando de manera remota desde Buenos Aires. Por ello, agradeceré si la Secretaría pudiera habilitar a mi colega para que pudiese tomar la palabra a través de la plataforma Zoom. Muchas gracias.
Buenos días. En primer lugar, aprovecho para agradecer a mis colegas argentinos por haberme dado la palabra. Agradezco también a la Secretaría y al presidente para que la Agencia Nacional de Materiales Controlados pueda estar participando en este espacio que nos resulta de sumo interés para poder avanzar en políticas de control de armas de fuego. En primer lugar, quería hacer hincapié en la vinculación existente que existe entre el uso de armas de fuego y demás materiales controlados, y la violencia por motivos de género. Creemos que esto es importante en miras de poder diseñar políticas públicas de prevención, acciones concretas, que tengan como finalidad la reducción de la violencia contra las mujeres. Concretamente, y en adición a las iniciativas desarrolladas para abordar dicha problemática, proponemos la confección de un cuestionario a los fines de poder compartir entre los estados partes experiencias y prácticas en pos de enriquecer el debate. La información recolectada nos parece que podría ser de suma utilidad para seguir trabajando, y Argentina manifiesta este interés en poder avanzar en la confección de las guías de actuación y de evaluación, que podrían ser de suma utilidad y servir como herramienta para los estados partes para poder realizar su propio análisis de riesgo. Mi delegación se encuentra abierta a intercambiar información con aquellas delegaciones interesadas en el proyecto de documento de trabajo, en el cual se encuentra trabajando ya la Argentina. Muchísimas gracias.
Ok. Muchas gracias, Argentina, por su intervención. Vamos ahora a escuchar la presentación del Comité Internacional de la Cruz Roja sobre el concepto de conocimiento, y a continuación daré la palabra a las delegaciones que así lo han solicitado: China, Panamá y Control Arms. La delegada del comité va a hacer su presentación desde el podio. Adelante.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, thank you for inviting the International Committee of the Red Cross to offer some remarks in the context of the sub-working group's exploration of Article 6.3, with focus on how knowledge and other relevant terms are interpreted in international law. Article 6 and 7, as we often like to say, are at the heart of the ATT. The faithful implementation of these provisions is paramount to realizing the ATT's humanitarian purpose. And one of the ATT's key aims reflected in Article 6.3 is to contribute to the prevention of serious international crimes by withholding the supply of weapons that would be used for their commission. Throughout the drafting history of the ATT, different formulations were proposed to articulate what absolute limits on arms transfers flow from states' pre-existing obligations under international law, including from peremptory norms, jus cogens norms of customary international law, and to develop these further. And the formulation ultimately retained is as follows. Next slide, please. That you're very familiar with. So, generally speaking, Article 6.3 contains few aspects that are, legally speaking, ambiguous. The main question, as we are all well aware here, is regards the interpretation of the level of knowledge that is required for a state party to prohibit the authorization of a transfer. And then, of course, questions remain about the practical application of the provision. Next slide, please. So to explore these questions, though in somewhat abridged form, given the limited time available, I'd like to just survey selected aspects of the international crimes that are listed in the provision. What acts constitute genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes tells us something about the sort of information that is relevant to states parties to know about. I'd also like to review or briefly touch upon states' due diligence obligations under international law to prevent these crimes, and then in light of this, look at the standard of knowledge and evidence that is appropriate, in our view, to Article 6.3. Next slide, please. Oh, yes, thanks. Yes, next slide, please. So as I said, the aim of Article 6.3 is to prevent the commission of some of the most serious international crimes, including the crime of genocide. And genocide has long been recognized as amounting to an international crime. It is formally prohibited in the 1948 Genocide Convention, and the Article 2 of that convention provides us indicated on the slide. To be aware of, for those less familiar with this area of law, genocide refers to acts committed with a specific intent to destroy certain types of groups, national, ethnic, racial, or religious groups. And acts of genocide can take diverse forms. So for the application of Article 6.3, however, it is immaterial whether an ATT state party is a party to the Genocide Convention, since genocide is prohibited under customary international law. Also worth noting that genocide can be committed in relation to an armed conflict or unrelated to an armed conflict. And so regarding what states parties should know in terms of the application of Article 6.3 is, on the one hand, they should have knowledge about how the arms recipient is likely to behave, and they should have knowledge about how the arms in question are likely to be used. In respect of the latter, and looking at the list of acts of genocide, we can already see that some of the acts do not require the discharging of a weapon. So, for instance, small arms could be used to threaten parents and children in the commission of the act of genocide or forcible transfer of children. With regard to the issue of the knowledge about how the recipient is going to behave, states parties to the ATT must refrain from transferring arms that would be used in the commission of genocide irrespective of whether perpetrated by a state or an individual, whether working for a state or in a private capacity. So there are some legal nuances there that are fairly complicated. I'll skip over these in practice. States parties therefore must examine the policies of the arms recipients' authorities, as well as their pattern of behavior, from which, in some circumstances, a genocidal policy may be inferred, and they must also examine whether individuals, whether there is a real risk that an individual has the intention to carry out genocide. If any of these is present, they must not authorize the transfer. Next slide, please. As with genocide, crimes against humanity can be committed in times of peace or relative peace and in situations of armed conflict, but there is no global convention on this crime. So the International Law Commission has prepared draft articles on the prevention and punishment of crimes against humanity in 2019. Article 2 offers a definition, which is reproduced on the slide. In essence, it reproduces the text of Article 7 of the Statute of the International Criminal Court and is without prejudice to broader definitions found in customary international law or domestic law. As regards states parties, ATT states parties, what they must ascertain or what is relevant to them in the application of Article 6.3. We can note that here the acts have to be committed against any civilian population, not only limit the groups thereof, irrespective of whether they are nationals or foreigners. But there is no requirement of a specific intent as for genocide, but there's a requirement of widespread or systematic attack. I'll skip over the nuances here. In essence, this excludes isolated, spontaneous, or unconnected acts of violence. And there is a link required to a state or organization. And so for states parties, what is particularly of interest here in the application of Article 6.3 is whether there's a multiplicity of victims, perhaps even in different locations, whether there is evidence of a pattern or methodical plan or acts in furtherance of a common policy, a recurrent modus operandi. Evidence of a policy can be expressed in statements of an arms recipient, but they can also be inferred from action or from inaction. For example, if a government fails to prosecute or discipline abuses, that may indicate that the actions were organized rather than impulsive. Next slide, please. Now, I'll deal with war crimes relatively briefly, since we've recently explored this subject in the connection of Article 7. Grave breaches of the 4 Geneva Conventions are listed in Articles 50, 51, 130, and 147 of the Geneva Conventions, the first, second, and third, and fourth, respectively. Reproduced here is the text of Article 130 of the third Geneva Convention for the, relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. So in this connection, what is relevant to know for states parties, notably, is whether the victim is a person protected under one of those conventions or property protected under any of the conventions. Grave breaches are war crimes. They can only be committed in international armed conflict or situations of occupation. So another question that states parties must know about is whether there is a situation, legally speaking, of international armed conflict and whether the recipient is a party thereto. And in this respect, I would invite you to consult the ICRC's commentary to the Geneva Conventions, the latest one from 2020. Article 6.3 also refers to attacks against civilians, civilian objects and civilians protected as such. This is these are war crimes in international and non-international armed conflicts. And here, perhaps just offer the ICRC's view is that depending on circumstances, indiscriminate attacks and disproportionate attacks could qualify as attacks directed against civilian objects or civilians protected as such. And then other war crimes, here what we see is that the scope depends on what the transferring state party, what treaties it is a party to. And the ICRC, with a view to humanitarian purpose of the ATT, to effectively prevent all kinds of war crimes that are typically committed with weapons, the ICRC recommends that states parties apply Article 6.3 to a wide range of war crimes in both international and non-international armed conflicts. And indeed, a number of states parties have declared that they do so. In this regard, too, I invite you to consult the ICRC's discussion of war crimes under customary international law in our study, referring to the Rule 156. Next slide, please. In the implementation of Article 6.3, arms transferring states should bear in mind their obligations under international law, irrespective or sort of aside from the ATT, and several states parties today have already mentioned that. Particular relevance, their due diligence obligations to prevent genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Now, this is a complicated and fascinating subject. I'll only highlight two aspects here. Next slide, please. In respect of states' due diligence obligation to prevent genocide, it's interesting to look at the International Court of Justice's judgment in 2007 concerning the application of the convention, the Genocide Convention, where the court noted that a state may be found to have violated its obligation to prevent, even though it had no certainty at that time when it should have acted but failed to do so, that genocide was about to be committed. It is enough that the state was aware, or should normally have been aware, of the serious danger. The ICJ further explained that the obligation is a duty to act, irrespective of whether that action will or is even likely to succeed. And that means that states that manifestly fail to make their best efforts, which are within their power, would fall short of that standard. And then similarly, as states parties have already mentioned also today in the discussion, there is an obligation under international humanitarian law to respect and ensure respect for IHL in all circumstances, including in arms transfer decisions. And this obligation includes, in the view of the ICRC, a due diligence obligation to do everything reasonably in a state's power to prevent violations of IHL when there is a foreseeable risk that they will be committed. Next slide, please. So with these considerations in mind, let's turn to the question of knowledge in Article 6.3. What standard of knowledge should apply? Next slide, please. A restrictive interpretation is that there needs to be actual knowledge of the future commission of international crimes, so that a state party's compliance with Article 6.3 would be measured at what it subjectively knew. Another interpretation is that there only needs to be constructive knowledge that the arms would be used to commit the listed crimes. State party's compliance would be measured at what the state objectively, based on credible, available information, should have known. Now, there may be little practical difference to the extent that actual knowledge may be inferred from the circumstances. The ICRC recommends that the term knowledge be interpreted objectively to include what a state party can normally be expected to know based on information in its possession or reasonably available to it. And this position is also reflected in the revised elements of a voluntary guide. And the ICRC would support the view expressed in that, in these elements, that this implies an obligation to actively seek out certain types of information that would normally be available. And so in regard of the information sources, then perhaps just interesting to note that the emphasis should be on intelligence and information about the likely future behavior of the recipient, and evidence beyond reasonable doubt of past crimes is not required. In this regard, the information sources included in sections C, D, and G of the list of possible reference documents to be considered by states in conducting risk assessments under Article 7 would seem to be particularly useful. Now, because the application of Article 6.3 calls for a prospective assessment of future events that are to be averted, it entails an evaluation of risk. But this evaluation must not be conflated with the export risk assessment mandated by Article 7. The risk of an international crime being committed with the transferred arms cannot be mitigated by measures envisaged in Article 7.2. So Article 6 establishes absolute prohibitions to transfer. But of course, a key practical question is, at what point should a transfer be denied? And scholarship and states have offered different applicable standards. Question, for instance, clear probability, a reasonable chance, a serious possibility, foreseeable, real risk, and so on. Now, in the view of the ICRC, a state party must deny a transfer under Article 6.3 if it has substantial grounds to believe, based on information in its possession or that is reasonably available to it, that the weapons or items would be used to commit one of the listed crimes. So substantial grounds requires more than a mere possibility, but a standard such as highly likely would in our view be too demanding, and certainty about future commission of a crime is not required. Article 6.3 contains the word would and not will. So perhaps just a brief point on the reference to the time of authorization in Article 6.3, read in conjunction with the obligations on general implementation under Article 5.2 and 5.5. A national control system must allow for the evaluation of this risk, the risk of serious crimes being committed with any of the weapons proposed for transfer and that will emanate from the state's jurisdiction. So the state needs to have the legal basis and the procedures in place that enable it to grant or deny such transfers. And it is our view that, against the backdrop of the ATT's purpose and also states' due diligence obligations under international law, that at the time of refers to the moment when the state becomes or should normally become aware of that risk. And this would imply a duty that does not end with the issuing of an export or import license or a transit authorization. So to sum up, next slide please. Article 6.3 establishes an absolute prohibition that allows for no exceptions. It should be interpreted in light of states' due diligence obligations under international law to prevent some of the most serious international crimes. What is expected of a state, the diligence that is due, depends on the circumstances, and states have some discretion and flexibility in terms of what measures they adopt, but these measures must be effective. They must be kept under review, and if found deficient, they must be strengthened. In practice, much will depend on the national control system of all states involved in a transfer. And since the application in practice of Article 6.3 can at times be challenging, The ICRC believes that consultations among states, exchange of information, exchange of information on the practical application would strengthen prevention-oriented implementation of Article 6.3. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Muchas gracias a la delegada de la Cruz Roja por su intervención, que nos ha clarificado en muchos aspectos las preguntas que nos estábamos planteando. Quedan ahora 3 delegaciones. Les agradecería si pudiesen ser lo más breves posible para no robar el tiempo al siguiente subgrupo de trabajo y a mi colega Rob Wensley, que tiene también preparada una intensa agenda de debates. La delegación de China tiene la palabra.
Thank you, Ambassador. I will be brief. 这是我第一次在本工作组进行发言。首先，我想代表中方感谢大使您及 ATT 秘书处为推进本工作组的工作所做的不懈努力。同时呢，中方也感谢 SRC 同事刚刚所做的介绍。今天呢，我们很高兴看到很多同事在这里就本工作组的问题进行了充分务实的讨论。中方相信呢，通过这样的讨论，有利于增强我们的理解，同时呢，也凝聚更多的共识，为缔约国更好的推进履约工作做出了很多有益的作用。中方也期待继续深入参与本工作组的工作。在这里呢，我想发表2点一般性的评论。第一，在涉及条约法律义务讨论时，中方认为应该避免对关键法律概念进行重新解释，防止超出条约适用范围和义务，切实维护条约的有效性和权威性。第二，中方支持各缔约国为加强履约能力建设，分享本国执行条约具体条款的履约实践。谢谢。
Muchas gracias a China por su intervención. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Panamá.
Muchas gracias, señor facilitador. En primer lugar, permítame agradecerle por sus esfuerzos y la excelente labor que usted está ejerciendo en este subgrupo de trabajo. Y por supuesto también a la Secretaría del ATT por su invaluable apoyo. Y también hacemos extensivo nuestro agradecimiento al Comité Internacional de la Cruz Roja por su presentación y su aporte en nuestras discusiones. Trataré de ser lo más breve posible. En primer lugar quisiera señalar que al igual que Suiza e Irlanda, nosotros también tendríamos reservas en entrar en un ejercicio de redefinir conceptos como el genocidio, crímenes de lesa humanidad, entre otros. También apoyamos plenamente el comentario realizado por México sobre la necesidad de priorizar los riesgos asociados con el acceso de la delincuencia organizada a las armas y municiones. También vemos con mucho interés el trabajo que está realizando Argentina en cuanto a género y consideramos que esa va a ser una valiosa contribución a las discusiones que estamos teniendo dentro del marco de este grupo de trabajo. Ahora bien, observando el documento que usted ha actualizado sobre los elementos de una guía voluntaria, consideramos que en el párrafo 16, entre los instrumentos se debería también incluir la Convención Internacional sobre la Eliminación de todas las formas de discriminación racial, como fue propuesto por el Estado de Palestina, ya que hemos visto que en los últimos años ha habido un aumento de los crímenes de odio por motivos raciales y étnicos, y hay una violencia armada acompañada a este tipo de delitos. También nos parece importante que se incluya la Convención Internacional para la Protección de todas las personas contra las desapariciones forzadas, y esta inclusión sería coherente incluso con lo que se menciona en el párrafo 17 en cuanto a las normas de jus cogens, porque se menciona precisamente la prohibición de las desapariciones forzadas. Volviendo al párrafo 16, notamos que se hace referencia al convenio para la represión de la trata de personas y de la explotación de la prostitución ajena. En ese sentido, nos parece también que sería relevante incluir el protocolo de Palermo es decir, protocolo para prevenir, reprimir y sancionar la trata de personas, especialmente mujeres y niños, que complementa la Convención de las Naciones Unidas contra la Delincuencia Organizada Transnacional. En el párrafo 26, que se refiere a instrumentos relativos a la violencia contra las mujeres, nos parece que también sería muy importante incluir la declaración y la plataforma de acción de Beijing, que no solo hace referencia a la violencia contra la mujer, también hace referencia al impacto del comercio de armas. Y por último, en el párrafo 28, que se refiere a la violencia contra los niños, si bien tomamos nota que se hace referencia a la Convención sobre los Derechos del Niño y al protocolo que es referente a la participación de los niños en conflictos armados, nos parece que también se debe incluir el otro protocolo facultativo, que es relativo a la venta de niños, la prostitución infantil y la utilización de niños en la pornografía, ya que esta es una de las manifestaciones más crueles de violencia contra los niños. Y en muchas ocasiones los niños, las víctimas, son coaccionadas a cometer este tipo o involucrarse en este tipo de actividades también por amenazas resultantes de, obviamente, con las armas. Esos serían nuestros comentarios preliminares. Esperamos en una fase posterior poder contribuir un poco más al respecto. Gracias.
Muchas gracias a la delegación de Panamá por sus aportaciones. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Control Arms.
Thank you very much, Mr. Facilitator. I would just like to provide a brief response to the question you raised concerning how to further elaborate in the undefined terms and concepts set out in Chapter 1 of the Voluntary Guide. One possibility would be to convene small group meetings of ATT stakeholders that could then make recommendations or share ideas with the subworking group. We're happy to explore this and other ideas on this topic in more detail, subsequently or in writing. Thank you very much, Mr. Facilitator.
Muchas gracias a la organización Control Arms por su continuado apoyo a nuestros trabajos. Y con esto llegamos al final de nuestra sesión de hoy, que creo que ha sido un trabajo exhaustivo sobre los conceptos que nos ocupaban. Tenemos muy claro que vamos a establecer una relación de instrumentos legales, convenciones, tratados, que serán siempre una referencia para los Estados parte a la hora de formar a sus agentes, con la libertad siempre en la aplicación de su legislación nacional y en el ejercicio de su soberanía de tomar las referencias que consideren oportunas y teniendo en cuenta los caveats señalados por varias delegaciones de que no se puede obligar a un Estado parte a aplicar una convención de la que no es parte, aunque ello no impide que puedan inspirarse en sus conceptos en la aplicación de su proceso nacional. Ese caveat, esa explicitación deberá figurar en nuestra guía claramente para que queden muy bien reflejadas las obligaciones de los Estados parte. Igualmente, las aportaciones de ONGs y estudios académicos al respecto que puedan sernos útiles. Quiero agradecer especialmente al Comité Internacional de la Cruz Roja su continuado apoyo a nuestra labor, sus aportaciones siempre objetivas, constructivas y muy útiles por lo exhaustivas y bien documentadas que nos ayudan a elaborar la guía del mejor modo posible. Antes de finalizar, quiero disculparme con mi colega Rob Wensley por robarle 8 minutos de su tiempo. Espero que sea comprensivo conmigo y ustedes lo sean con él en la próxima sesión. Muchísimas gracias. Damos por finalizada esta sesión.
Okay, let me just. If I can call the meeting to order. We are now making a transition to the second part of this afternoon. It's article number 9, the sub-working group on article number 9, transit and transshipment. And Mr. Rob Wensley of South Africa would facilitate this as a facilitator. I hand over to you, Rob. Thank you.
The interpretation, where is the English? Thank you, Dumisani, and good afternoon, colleagues. We're a little bit behind, but let's see if we can make some progress. What I'm going to do is to give an overview of what we've done thus far in terms of the multi-year work plan, what we're going to do today and tomorrow, and then one topic for future work that we need to look at. So I'm going to give that overview, then give the floor to Dr. Hernig, which for whom you would know from our last session, those of you who were here, to do a presentation, and then we are going to have an interactive discussion. Could you bring up the slides for me, please, Secretary? No, the other one. That's it. All right. So in case you were wondering what we're doing here, we're the sub-working group on Article 9, transit or transshipment. So in essence, the subgroup was established in December 2019, and the topics in the work plan were adopted in March 2021. So the emphasis is on sharing national practice on what we did. So there are a couple of topics that we focused on. The first, in our first analysis of this issue, was a discussion on national approaches to the terms transit and transshipment. And we looked particularly at trying to unpack those terms in terms of our national control systems. Topic 2, we looked at what Article 9 actually states, and there are phrases such as under its jurisdiction, as well as through its territory in accordance with international law. And we had a discussion on that. We had differing views on this, especially certain states parties felt that we shouldn't try and reinterpret international law. Point taken, that's not what we're here to do. We are here to, at best, develop a voluntary guide on how to implement this particular article in the convention. Article 3, we looked at regulation of transit and transshipment of arms by land, and particularly in terms of transit and transshipment of arms by both road and rail in practice. Once again, looking at regulatory measures that we have, as well as the issue of free trade zones. We did something similar on transit and transshipment by air in the same session. That was in our February session. And we looked once again at national regulatory measures and which government departments or agencies or entities or structures were involved in that process. So the additional topics left for us to discuss is the one that we're going to tackle this afternoon, measures to regulate the transit and transshipment of arms by by sea, which is perhaps the predominant method. Once again, which government departments and agencies are involved, and as well as what do the international and regional instruments say about this particular thing. Tomorrow morning, we'll tackle the issue of the role of the private sector, on which few of us are actually experts, because most of us come either from governments, international organizations, or non-governmental organizations. So we'll have a kickoff presentation on that issue as well, and then an interactive discussion following that. There's one thing that some of you have alluded to previously. It's the last topic in our work plan, and that is the relationship between Article 9 on transit and transshipment, and then Articles 6 and 7, which Ambassador Sanchez has just covered as well in his session. Article 11, diversion. Article 12, and record keeping. Now, considerations relating to the multi-year work plan, overarching considerations. Has sufficient time been allocated to each topic? Have any key concepts that should be unpacked be omitted? And then we would, I think, as the other facilitators have emphasized, we depend very heavily on your written inputs on this. I know that there are comments that have been made in Ambassador Sanchez's sessions about only 20 presentations or written inputs have been made, which is insufficient and so on. Well, actually, I envy him because he's received far more than I have. And without these written inputs, we can't prepare a voluntary guide, as simple as that. So I would urge you to reflect on all the topics in this, not only today's topic, but all the topics, and to give us something in writing. I would much appreciate that. I hand over the floor to Dr. Hernig, if the Secretariat could pull up her presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon also from my side. I have the pleasure to talk about transshipment and transit of arms by sea from a transport law perspective. I try to be not too technical. My agenda is, after a short introduction, I would like to give an overview about the arms transport by sea from the private law perspective, followed by transit restrictions in the context of transport by sea from regulatory side. As an overview, oh, okay, do you see this slide? No, it's a bit big. I'm really, really sorry. So as an overview, there are several topics to tackle. So we have the transport, including loading and discharging. From a private law perspective and from international perspective, we have the Hague-Wisby rules, which are frequently used in international transport. If the Hague-Wisby rules are not applicable, usually domestic law applies to it. It also applies in the context of charter parties, of course. From a regulatory perspective, it's the firearm protocol and the Wassenaar agreement. Regarding the storage, safety, that is of course slightly touched upon by the Hague-Wisby rules, but we also have the International Convention of the Safety of Life at Sea, the so-called SOLAS Convention. Dangerous goods may be an issue, but I will come to this later. That's in the context of Article 9, it is not that big of an issue. There we have an International Maritime Dangerous Goods Code as an annex to the SOLAS Convention. For the transit itself, the Hague-Wisby rules apply to the entire journey of the transport and We also have the UNCLOS Convention, so the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, which Professor Patrick already referred to earlier. For arrest as a particular delicate problem, I also mentioned at the slide, unfortunately you cannot see it, the Arrest Convention and regionally the EU Customs Code. Before I go into the transport and the transit itself, I would like to highlight the importance of transshipment in Article 9 because of what you see here, the Port of Rotterdam. The Port of Rotterdam is rather large. There are a lot of operations going on. There are a lot of hinterland networks that need to be considered by saying, okay, we regulate the entire transshipment. So it's not only about a vessel that's being cleared or about simple unloading operations. It's much more when we talk about transshipment. The ATT itself does not define the transshipment. I wanted to highlight that there is at least one international convention on the liability of the operator of transport terminals. The terminal operator is one that is performing transport or procuring transport-related services. This entails storage, warehousing, loading, unloading, stowage, trimming, dunnaging, and lashing. So here you see how many operations are involved in such a transshipment, especially in the context of the transport by sea. For the regulatory perspective, of course, the User's Guide to European Union Council Position 2008 from 1944 is relevant, and there it states the transshipment is the transit involving the physical operation of unloading goods from the importing means of transport followed by reloading general onto another exporting means of transport. So it is in general a gap, but please, I would urge that this gap should not be underestimated because it involves a lot of loading. It involves stowage plans and storage at the vessel, and it involves discharge. Of course, the port is a major storage area where goods, in particular arms, can get lost. It is the final destination for a vessel, not only arrested vessels, and it is relevant, the transshipment area itself is relevant for permission to unload. So this is relevant in the context of prohibition and restrictions. When we have a look at the transport by sea, from a transport law perspective, as I said, the Hague-Wisby rules apply. The Hague-Wisby rules base on the Hague rules plus the Wisby Protocol from 1968. It was amended 1979 regarding the limits of liability of the carrier. There are also the Hamburg rules. These are in force, but they are not as frequently used as the Hague-Wisby rules. The Hague-Wisby rules only apply if the transport is covered by a bill of lading or a similar document of title. That gives private parties the opportunity to opt out by simply using a waybill, so a normal transport document, and then there is no international regime. So how do the Hague-Wisby rules work? Well, they apply in relation between the shipper and the carrier. And that is basically quite similar to what what I presented last time already. In the context of arms transport, it is important that the shipper is the one that needs to provide all necessary information, all necessary documents, and of course also all necessary licenses. The carrier on his side has the crucial duties like storage and loading. I would like to dive into this a bit. The legal basis can be found in Article 3 of the Hague-Wisby rules. According to Article 3 of the Hague-Wisby rules, the carrier is obliged to make the ship seaworthy, man and equip it sufficiently, and basically to have a cargo-worthy ship. What does this mean in arms transport context? Well, of course, the ship must be fit for the journey. That is quite clear. The crew must be trained sufficiently to handle these types of goods. And the vessel must be prepared for these types of goods. In particular, when we talk about arms transport, in the context of Article 2, this means that we have heavy vessels, that we have heavy goods, that we have bulky cargo that needs to be secured on board. And this means that the crew must be trained in a way that it can keep this cargo on board. Last but not least, the cargo worthiness also implies if we have particular sensitive goods that cannot be stored close to temperature sensitive goods or explosive goods, thus must be considered as well for the storage. Then the carrier is under a contingent obligation to properly carefully load, handle, stow, carry, keep, and care for and discharge the goods. What does this mean in the context of arms transport? Here you see a storage plan of a vessel. If the vessel is loaded only on one side with heavy weapons, heavy arms, this means that the seaworthiness of the vessel is endangered. If there is a marine casualty as a consequence of this, this means that weapons can end up being in the sea, ultimately at a certain beach, and then of course this must be secured, that the weapons are not, or that arms in general are not being rescued illegally. For bulky cargo, especially tanks, it must be certain that these tanks are lashed appropriately. This sounds rather natural, but there is case law explicitly on tanks that were not lashed appropriately and ended up in sea. So then, if you are lucky, that may end up on the ground. If not, if it's lighter weapons, may end up being on beaches. For the loading process itself, there are international standards set by the SOLAS Convention that need to be complied with by the carrier himself. A next issue may be dangerous goods. There is an annex in the SOLAS Convention on dangerous goods, but it becomes only relevant in the context of ammunition, and Article 9 does not refer to ammunition. It only refers to the goods, to the arms mentioned in Article 2. There is another special issue, deviation. I know that Article 11 of the ATT deals with it. From a private law perspective, deviation is not a problem. The carrier can deviate from the prescribed route as long as the deviation is reasonable or for the rescue of life. And there is a certain conflict, but of course, the regulatory side prevails. As an add-on, there is also a rule in the SOLAS Convention regarding the prevention to the introduction of unauthorized weapons, incendiary devices, or explosive to ships or port facilities that may be considered in the present context as well. Coming to intermediate stops, that may be an issue as well, especially if the vessel, and if a vessel carries weapon, it's still a merchant vessel. If a vessel gets arrested under the Arrest Convention, then of course it must be considered that there is sufficient permission given to unload the goods, for instance. Regarding the transit restrictions, that can become relevant in two different scenarios. So first we have the scenario on sea, so during the voyage, and secondly, we have the scenario for discharge permission, so whether the goods can be unloaded, whether arms can be unloaded at port of destination. Regarding the first one, I want to keep it rather short because Professor Patrick already elaborated on the concept of innocent passage under the UNCLOS Convention. Generally, an innocent passage is a passage or is a voyage that is not aggressive, so it's only the passage that is relevant. It's not the nature of the goods that are loaded. But if there is, for instance, a UN Security Council arms embargo, this may or must enjoy preferences and prevail over the innocent passage, also in accordance with Article 6 of the ATT. Last but not least, we also have an issue at the port of destination. So now you may say, well, if the goods are not permitted to be released, the customs authority can simply say, okay, we keep it at the vessel and then that's it. But if an embargo or a prohibition is imposed on goods along the journey, the storage plans were not adjusted. This means that there is cargo that may be stored underneath the cargo that is prohibited for unloading. And this means that, of course, it must be unloaded in order to free the cargo that is stored underneath. And for this situation, there must be rules. Under the EU Customs Code, the customs authorities are allowed to confiscate the cargo, so to ensure that they are not lost in a way. But there are, or this is a delicate situation that must be considered as well. Thank you for your attention. That is it. I'm looking forward to your questions and thank you for the chance again. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hoenig. I would like to open the floor for questions, first of all, actually, to Dr. Hoenig, but also general comments on this particular topic, transit and transshipment by sea. I see a hand, but I don't see a flag. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm Mr. Barouti Likoy from Recherche et Documentation Juridique Africaine, and I want to intervene here on my individual capacity as a lawyer involved specialized in shipping and maritime business. I don't have a question, but some clarification on the presentation. The first one is about trained crew for the shipping sector. Normally, big shipping company used to select crew who is cheapest possible in the market. And if we take this view, it's very difficult to have a training crew who can easily detect or follow the standard of control of arms in the shipping business. So this is the first information or clarification I wanted to give. The second is that it is very difficult to find a ship, especially that we call liner, from point A to point B only with arm as goods. It's always that we call feeder. The ship will stop by almost every port to discharge the good, and the arm can be discharged in the port C of D or at the end of the travel. That's the second clarification. The third one is the nature of the port. Now we have three sorts of ports. We have public ports, we have private ports, we have that we call community ports of mixed. And all that kind of ports works according to the 3 shifts, night, afternoon, and morning. So the best solution here is to ask that all ship or boats carrying the arm should only reach the public port for the control. It's very difficult to do control through the crew because every shipper they put the crew the cheapest possible, and most of them from Philippines and or Malaysia and all the developing country, or it's difficult to control where the ship will reach the port. If it's a private port, the ship can reach on Sunday. That there is no official officer to make control. The ship reach Sunday and remain until Monday when the office will be open. But in the meantime, they can do the diversion of arms. So the best solution is to ask that all ship carry, all masters who know that the ship carry the arm should reach only the official port and during the official hour of work. That is the clarification I wanted to give on my individual capacity as an academic involved in shipping and maritime business. Thank you.
Thank you. And this is why it's very important to have strong national regulations, legislation and regulations on this, because if the ship is carrying arms, how can it dock in the first place? That's my question. But I don't need an answer to that right now. Before I pass the floor to Dr. Hernick to possibly respond, is there anyone else, any other delegation that wishes to take the floor on the presentation or on the topic as a whole? Okay, while you think about that, Dr. Hernick, would you like to respond?
Thank you very much for the clarification. Yes, of course, that is definitely a problem. From a legal perspective and based on the Hague-Wisby rules, there is a clear duty of the carrier to train the crew, but I know that the reality is different. But maybe this is also an issue that should be addressed by the Maritime Labour Convention and the International Maritime Organization and the rules implemented there.
Thank you. Anyone else wishes to take the floor? Or are we going to have an early afternoon? France, you have the floor.
Je vous remercie. Merci, monsieur le facilitateur, et merci beaucoup au docteur Horning pour sa présentation extrêmement complète. Je vais essayer de partager pour peut-être créer un échange et alimenter ce qui vient d'être dit, l'expérience de la France sur transit et transbordement. Donc, comme ça a été déjà dit, la question du contrôle des activités de transit ou de transbordement par voie maritime est une question très complexe. La régulation de ces activités doit tenir compte des instruments internationaux existants et en particulier les dispositions pertinentes de la Convention des Nations Unies sur le droit de la mer. Ça a été rappelé. Et il est également important que les États tiennent compte dans le choix de leurs procédures nationales, de leurs besoins et priorités. La France exerce un contrôle sur les opérations de transit et de transbordement, mais ne soumet pas toutes ces opérations à autorisation préalable. Celle-ci est ainsi requise pour le transit par route de frontière à frontière. Les opérations de transbordement avec mise à terre dans les ports français sont également soumises à la délivrance préalable d'une autorisation de transit de matériel de guerre. C'est la douane qui délivre ces autorisations et c'est également la douane qui effectue un contrôle sur les flux physiques entrants et sortants. À ce titre, les agents des douanes procèdent à un contrôle documentaire et peuvent également procéder au contrôle des marchandises et des moyens de transport. S'agissant du rôle des acteurs privés dans le transit transbordement, il est essentiel à plusieurs titres. Les acteurs privés jouent un rôle majeur dans la mise en œuvre des mesures de contrôle et de régulation. Ça passe d'abord par le fait d'exercer un contrôle renforcé sur les personnes impliquées dans le commerce des armes et les opérations associées. En France, par exemple, une autorisation préalable est nécessaire pour exercer des activités de fabrication, de commerce et d'intermédiation. C'est ce que nous appelons en français une AFCI. Elle est délivrée par le ministère des Armées. C'est un prérequis indispensable dans la mesure où, en France, l'ensemble du secteur de la défense et de ses flux est soumis à un régime de prohibition. En outre, les demandes d'autorisation de transit ne peuvent être établies que par une personne titulaire du statut d'opérateur économique agréé. Cela suppose également de veiller à une bonne coopération avec ces opérateurs, de les sensibiliser aux mesures et procédures en vigueur en matière de contrôle du commerce des armes et de les inciter à développer des mesures de conformité. En France, de nombreuses activités de sensibilisation sont menées auprès des acteurs privés, notamment par le biais de l'organisation de conférences dédiées organisées chaque année par la Direction générale de l'armement du ministère français des Armées. Les acteurs privés jouent également un rôle en matière de prévention et de lutte contre les trafics illicites, y compris en phase de transit. Ils peuvent ainsi être amenés à coopérer avec les autorités nationales, notamment en vue de l'interception de flux illicites. Je vous remercie.
Thank you to the distinguished representative of France. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Argentina.
Muchas gracias, facilitador. Valoramos el esfuerzo que usted lidera para realizar un compendio de normativa y buenas prácticas en materia de tránsito y transbordo. Creemos que será valioso para mejorar nuestras prácticas y procesos nacionales, así como en general en el contexto de ATT. Quisiéramos señalar que en el ámbito del Mercosur rige la decisión 2 del año 94, que adopta para los Estados miembros un acuerdo denominado Transporte de Mercancías Peligrosas en el Mercosur, y rige para transporte terrestre, aéreo y marítimo. Dicho acuerdo establece disposiciones en cuanto a identificación del material peligroso, identificación de los vehículos y exigencias de capacitación especial de los conductores. Asimismo, la Argentina tiene, por supuesto, regulaciones especiales en materia de transporte de este tipo de mercancías, sobre las cuales daremos detalles oportunamente. Muchas gracias.
I thank you.
Quisiera tomar la palabra por la Agencia Nacional de Materiales Controlados de la República Argentina.
I don't know who that was. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor facilitador. Como esta es mi primera intervención, quiero agradecerle por el trabajo que viene realizando. Respecto al artículo 9, veo que está bien encaminado y comentar que para el Perú el tema de este artículo es relevante, dado que es muy poco lo que nosotros podemos saber al respecto. Es decir, el tránsito es relevante respecto a cómo controlar de manera debida las armas convencionales y evitar que éstas se desvíen. Si no hay una buena comunicación o el compartir comunicación entre el exportador, el país de tránsito y el importador, entonces es poco lo que podemos hacer para controlar debidamente las armas convencionales, ¿no? El comercio. Al respecto, también me sumo a algunas intervenciones en las que consideran que es relevante la capacitación o el fortalecimiento de capacidades de los transportistas o de aquellos que van a llevar o van a cumplir una función respecto al transporte y el desplazamiento de las armas. También considero que es relevante, como ya lo señalé, el compartir información entre estos tres actores, ¿no? Y también una exhaustiva y coherente y detallada regulación del transporte, del transbordo y del tránsito de armas. En resumen, es eso lo que nosotros consideramos relevante respecto al artículo 9. Gracias.
Thank you, Peru. Do I see any more delegations that wish to intervene at this point? We have none online, I would assume. That is not the case at the moment. I would like to invite Dr. Hernig to respond to some of the comments made thus far. Dr. Hernig.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I can just repeat regarding the training. Yes, of course, this is very, very relevant. The problem is usually it's not sufficient to share the information just between three parties. If we look at the overall system, how it works at vessels, then we usually have multiple parties involved at one vessel providing different levels of seafarer, and this makes it rather complicated because we have a lot of subcontracts involved and their information may get lost. Regarding the cooperation with the maritime operators, this is really, really relevant, especially in the port field. But it's not only the maritime operators, also the hinterland operators that are really, have a crucial role in the entire transshipment operations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hernig. Well, we don't see anyone else wishing to take the floor. I would therefore move to conclude this meeting. I'd like to thank Dr. Hernig for coming to give us a presentation, a very insightful presentation, an overview that would not have confused many of us because it was fairly straightforward this time. Her previous presentation on transit transshipment by land lost me a little bit, but that's due to my own shortcomings and not nothing else. If you think of something overnight or this evening that you still wish to raise on this particular issue, transit or transshipment by sea, or any of the other previous topics, please do not hesitate to do so tomorrow morning. Our session, as I said, tomorrow morning will cover the private sector, and it is likely that there will be time for you to intervene at that particular stage. So before I adjourn, I would like to ask the Secretariat, Dumisani, if he has any announcement to make. Dumisani?
Thank you, Rob. I've got just two announcements to make. The first one is after the closure of this session, as already communicated to delegates, we have a side event that is taking place. It is organized by the German presidency. It's on their priority theme of post-shipment controls. It will be held virtually. It will not be an in-person workshop. It's a virtual workshop, and all delegates will be invited to participate in this. The information about this workshop is already on the website under the relevant page, the site events, and including the link. If you need the link, and you can go to the ATT website and you'll find the link of this workshop there. So the presidency is encouraging all delegates to attend or to participate in this workshop. It's very important because it concerns the post-shipment controls, which is a priority theme of the German presidency for the year. The second one is about uploading of statements. Delegates who would like to have their statements uploaded on the ATT website are free to do so, and they can just transmit those statements to the Secretariat, and would post them on the website accordingly. And the last one is about video recordings. It has become tradition that we have the recordings, video recordings of these proceedings. And the videos then of the proceedings of today would start to be available tomorrow, and in that particular order until the end of the week. But you would be able to listen to proceedings of today at your own time using the videos that will be posted on the website. Thank you so much, Mr. Facilitator. Hand back over to you.
My thanks to the Secretariat. If there is no delegation wishing to take the floor, I wish you a good afternoon and evening, and we'll see each other here tomorrow. This meeting is adjourned. No, it's not adjourned. I see a flag. Kenya, Zambia, sorry.
I just wanted to find a clarification. Is it morning or afternoon tomorrow?
It's in your welcome pack, and it's on the ATT website, and it's everywhere. It's at 1 o'clock. Luckily in the afternoon.
Thank you, because
and not 1 a.m.
I heard you say morning tomorrow. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. This meeting is adjourned.